The morning sun cast long shadows across Henderson Executive Airport as Dr. Michelle Carter walked purposefully toward the private terminal. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing through the quiet space. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned every accomplishment in her life. Her crisp white blazer and navy pencil skirt reflected her professional status as one of the country's top neurosurgeons. The early hour meant few people were around, but those present couldn't help noticing her graceful presence. She had done this routine countless times before, arriving at private terminals to fly out for emergency surgeries. Today's case was particularly urgent. The governor's daughter needed immediate specialized treatment that only Dr. Carter could provide. As she approached the security checkpoint, Dr. Carter already had her credentials ready, her medical license, hospital ID, and boarding pass for the private jet neatly arranged in her hand. She had learned long ago that being prepared helped minimize unnecessary delays, though it didn't always prevent them. James Wilson stood at his post, his security guard uniform pressed and badge gleaming. At 55, he had only been working at the executive airport for 3 months, a late career change after working security at a shopping mall for 20 years. He watched Dr. Carter approach with narrowing eyes, his hand automatically moving to rest on his radio. "Excuse me," Wilson called out before she even reached the checkpoint. "This is a private terminal. I think you might be lost." His tone carried that familiar condescending note that Dr. Carter had heard too many times before. Dr. Carter took a steady breath and maintained her professional smile. "Good morning, sir. I'm Dr. Michelle Carter. I have a flight scheduled." She extended her documents toward him, but Wilson didn't move to take them. "Ma'am, these jets are for private clients only," Wilson said, speaking slowly as if explaining something to a child. "The regular terminal is back that way." He pointed toward the main airport building, not even glancing at her documentation. A young woman behind the check-in counter watched the scene unfold, her discomfort visible as she shifted from foot to foot. Dr. Carter remained calm, though her heart rate picked up slightly, not from nervousness, but from the familiar surge of having to prove herself yet again. "Sir, I am a private client," Dr. Carter stated firmly. "I'm the lead neurosurgeon flying out for an emergency procedure. These are my credentials, my medical license, and my boarding pass. You'll find everything in order." Wilson finally took the documents, but his movements were exaggeratedly slow, his skepticism written across his face. He studied each paper as if searching for forgery, occasionally glancing up at Dr. Carter with unconcealed doubt. "These could be anybody's papers," he said after a moment. "I'll need to call this in for verification." He reached for his radio, still holding her documents hostage. Dr. Carter checked her watch. 6:45 a.m. The flight was scheduled for 7:00 a.m., and every minute of delay meant precious time lost for her patient. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number, maintaining eye contact with Wilson. "Dr. Thompson." "Yes, I'm at the terminal, but we seem to have a situation with security." She spoke clearly, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Would you mind coming to the checkpoint? Apparently, my credentials need additional verification." Wilson's face tightened as he overheard the conversation. He stood straighter, still clutching her documents, his jaw working as if he wanted to say something more but couldn't quite find the words. The young woman at the counter finally found her voice. "Mr. Wilson, those credentials match our flight manifest. Dr. Carter is listed as our 7 a.m. departure." Wilson turned to the counter clerk, his expression hardening. "April, I know how to do my job. We have procedures to follow." He turned back to Dr. Carter. "Anyone could make up documents. I'm responsible for security here, and I need to be absolutely certain." Dr. Carter stood perfectly still, her expression neutral but determined. She'd faced this type of treatment throughout her career, in medical school, during her residency, and even as an attending physician. Each time, she met it with the same composed resistance, knowing that her response would likely impact how others in similar situations would be treated in the future. The sound of quick footsteps echoed through the terminal as Dr. Thompson, a gray-haired man in his 60s, approached the checkpoint. The morning sun had barely risen, but the day's first battle against prejudice was already well underway at Henderson Executive Airport. Dr. Thompson's arrival changed the energy in the terminal immediately. He was dressed casually in khakis and a blue button-down shirt, his hospital ID swinging from his neck as he walked quickly toward the checkpoint. Wilson straightened his uniform, still holding Dr. Carter's documents tightly in his hand. "What seems to be the problem here?" Dr. Thompson asked, looking between Wilson and Dr. Carter. His tone was pleasant but carried the authority of someone used to managing difficult situations. Wilson cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm just following security protocols. We need to verify." "She's already provided her credentials," Dr. Thompson interrupted, gesturing to the papers in Wilson's hand. "I can personally vouch for Dr. Carter. She's the leading pediatric neurosurgeon on the East Coast." A small group of airport staff had gathered at a distance, watching the scene unfold. April, the counter clerk, had stepped closer, her clipboard clutched to her chest. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's glass walls, casting long shadows across the polished floor. "With all due respect, sir," Wilson persisted, "anyone could claim to be a doctor. I've seen all sorts of scams in my 20 years of security work." He looked at Dr. Carter dismissively. "Just last month at my old job, we caught someone pretending to be a bank executive." Dr. Carter maintained her composure, though her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her medical bag. "Mr. Wilson, I understand you're doing your job. However, I provided multiple forms of identification, my medical license, and my flight authorization. The manifest confirms my booking. What additional verification could you possibly need?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. "Maybe you're someone's assistant," he suggested, his prejudice showing clearly now. "Or maybe you're delivering something for the real doctor." A sharp intake of breath came from April at the counter. Dr. Thompson's friendly expression hardened into something more severe. But before either could speak, Dr. Carter took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Wilson, I am not anyone's assistant. I am Dr. Michelle Carter, Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Boston Memorial Hospital. In my bag are surgical plans for an emergency procedure that cannot wait. Every minute we spend here is a minute wasted, time that my patient doesn't have." Wilson's radio crackled to life. "Security check-in for the 7 a.m. flight?" a voice questioned. He grabbed his radio quickly. "Yes, I'm verifying credentials for someone claiming to be Dr. Carter." The word claiming came out with particular emphasis. "The surgeon," the voice responded. "Yes, we have her clearance from the governor's office." "Priority clearance, actually. Is there a problem?" The color drained slightly from Wilson's face, but his expression remained stubborn. "The governor's office?" he repeated. "That's right," Dr. Thompson said firmly. "Dr. Carter has been specifically requested for this case. She's flying out to perform emergency surgery on the governor's daughter. A procedure, I might add, that only a handful of surgeons in the country are qualified to perform." Wilson looked down at the credentials in his hand, then back at Dr. Carter, as if seeing her for the first time. The mention of the governor's office had clearly rattled him, but old prejudices died hard. His hand holding the documents trembled slightly. I still need to follow procedures," he mumbled, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. April stepped forward, her young face flushed with determination. "Mr. Wilson, it's 6:52. The jet is waiting, and we have confirmation from both the hospital and the governor's office. Dr. Carter's credentials are valid. What procedures exactly are we still following?" The question hung in the air. Other staff members watched intently, the silence in the terminal broken only by the distant sound of jet engines. Dr. Carter stood quietly, her expression neutral but her eyes fixed steadily on Wilson. She had faced moments like this throughout her career, moments when someone's prejudice collided head-on with her reality, creating a crisis of understanding that could either break down barriers or reinforce them. Wilson's next action would determine more than just whether Dr. Carter made her flight. It would reveal whether he could begin to see past his own biases, or if he would allow them to potentially harm not only his career, but more importantly, an innocent patient's life. The tense silence in the terminal was broken by the urgent ring of Dr. Thompson's phone. He answered quickly, his face growing serious as he listened. The morning sun that had been streaming through the windows now felt uncomfortably warm as everyone waited. "I understand," Dr. Thompson said into the phone, his voice tight with concern. "Yes, she's right here. We're dealing with a security situation." He paused, listening again. "The patient's pressure is rising. Yes, I'll let her know immediately." Dr. Carter watched Dr. Thompson's face, reading the signs of medical urgency she knew too well. Wilson still stood holding her documents, but his posture had changed slightly. Uncertainty had begun to crack his rigid stance. "That was the governor's chief of staff," Dr. Thompson announced, putting his phone away. "The patient's condition is deteriorating. They need us there as soon as possible." He turned to Wilson, all pretense of patience gone. "Mr. Wilson, that young girl's life depends on Dr. Carter's expertise. Every minute we waste here increases the risk." Wilson's face flushed red. I just need to be certain." "Let me be clear about exactly who you're detaining," Dr. Thompson interrupted, his voice carrying across the terminal. "Dr. Michelle Carter is the surgeon who developed the groundbreaking technique for pediatric brain stem repairs. She's performed over 300 successful surgeries using this method. She's the reason the governor specifically requested her for his daughter's operation." April, the counter clerk, stepped forward with a tablet in her hands. "Mr. Wilson, I've pulled up Dr. Carter's profile from the hospital website. Would you like to see it?" Before Wilson could respond, another voice called out from across the terminal. "James, what's the holdup?" A man in a crisp security supervisor's uniform strode toward them. His nameplate read Roberts, and his face showed concern as he took in the scene. "Sir," Wilson started, "I was just verifying." "Is that Dr. Carter?" Supervisor Roberts interrupted, his eyes widening in recognition. "My wife works at Boston Memorial. She was talking about you just last week, about how you saved the twins' lives with that impossible surgery." Dr. Carter smiled warmly at the supervisor. "The Henderson twins. Yes, that was a challenging case. They're both doing very well now." Wilson looked between his supervisor and Dr. Carter, his hands now loose around her documents. The reality of who stood before him was becoming impossible to ignore. "Dr. Carter," Supervisor Roberts continued, "I apologize for any delay. My wife showed me the article about your work in the medical journal. She said you're revolutionizing pediatric neurosurgery." Just then, Dr. Carter's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly, her professional calm masking the urgency she felt. "The patient's intracranial pressure is continuing to rise," she announced. "We need to leave now." Wilson finally held out Dr. Carter's documents, his hand trembling slightly. I apologize for the delay," he mumbled, but his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "Mr. Wilson," Dr. Carter said firmly but not unkindly, "I understand you were trying to do your job. But right now, I need to do mine. A 12-year-old girl's life depends on it." The revelation of the patient's age seemed to hit Wilson hard. He stepped back from the checkpoint, finally clearing the way. His face showed a mix of emotions: embarrassment, confusion, and the first signs of genuine regret. "Dr. Carter," April called out, hurrying forward. "The pilot just confirmed they're ready for immediate takeoff. I'll escort you to the jet." As Dr. Carter and Dr. Thompson followed April toward the tarmac, the gathered airport staff began to disperse. Wilson stood rooted to his spot, watching them leave. Supervisor Roberts remained beside him, his expression stern but thoughtful. "James," Roberts said quietly, "we need to talk after your shift." The sound of Dr. Carter's heels faded down the corridor as she rushed toward the waiting jet. Behind her, she left not just a confused and humbled security guard, but a moment that would force many in that terminal to confront their own hidden biases. The morning sun now filled the terminal completely, illuminating every corner, much like how this incident had illuminated prejudices that could no longer hide in the shadows. 3 days had passed since the incident with Dr. Carter. Wilson sat at the security desk, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his actions. The morning sunlight streamed through the terminal windows, just as it had on that fateful day, but everything felt different now. He had spent these days in a fog of shame and self-reflection. The news of the successful surgery on the governor's daughter had spread quickly through the airport staff. April, the counter clerk, had shared the newspaper article about how Dr. Carter's quick action and expertise had saved the young girl's life, the same girl whose treatment he had delayed. Any later, the article had quoted the governor, "And my daughter might not have made it." Those words had kept Wilson awake for 3 nights straight. Today was his first shift back after 2 days off. Supervisor Roberts had given him time to think things through. The conversation they'd had after his shift that day still rang in his ears. "James," Roberts had said, "I've known you for years. You're better than what you showed that day." The terminal was quiet this morning, giving Wilson too much time with his thoughts. He kept replaying the incident in his mind. How he had refused to even look at Dr. Carter's credentials properly, how he had assumed she must be someone's assistant, how his prejudices had nearly cost a child her life. April approached his desk, carrying her usual morning coffee. She had been cold toward him since the incident, but today her expression was different. "Mr. Wilson," she said softly, "Dr. Carter's flight is scheduled to return this morning." Wilson's heart jumped into his throat. "What time?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "9 a.m., April replied. "About 30 minutes from now." Wilson nodded, his hands fidgeting with his uniform sleeve. He had rehearsed what he would say if he ever saw Dr. Carter again, but now that the moment was approaching, all of his practiced words felt inadequate. The next 30 minutes crawled by like hours. Wilson watched the terminal entrance, his stomach tight with anxiety. Then, at exactly 9 o'clock, he saw her. Dr. Carter walked through the doors, her white coat draped over her arm, looking tired but satisfied. The kind of satisfied that comes from saving a life. She saw Wilson at his post and paused briefly before walking directly toward him. Wilson stood up, his legs shaking slightly. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice cracking with emotion, I owe you an apology." Dr. Carter studied his face carefully. The terminal had gone quiet, with April and other staff members watching from a distance. "That day," Wilson continued, "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I almost caused," his voice broke again, "I almost caused a tragedy because I couldn't see past my own biases." Dr. Carter set her bag down and looked Wilson directly in the eyes. "Mr. Wilson, do you know why I decided to walk up to your desk today?" Wilson shook his head. "Because in my 20 years as a surgeon, you're the first person who's ever tried to apologize for this kind of treatment." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Most people just pretend it never happened." Wilson blinked back tears he hadn't expected. "I spent every minute since that day thinking about what I did, about how wrong I was, about how I've probably been wrong many other times before." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "Recognition is the first step toward change, Mr. Wilson. What matters now is what you do with this understanding." "I want to do better," Wilson said firmly. "I've asked Supervisor Roberts about additional training programs, and I've been reading about implicit bias and how it affects our actions even when we don't realize it." A small smile appeared on Dr. Carter's face. "The young girl is doing well," she said gently. "She'll make a full recovery." Wilson let out a shaky breath. "Thank God. And thank you. Not just for saving her, but for making me see what I needed to see about myself." Dr. Carter picked up her bag. "Sometimes, Mr. Wilson, the hardest surgeries we need to perform are the ones on our own hearts and minds." She extended her hand to him. "Keep learning. Keep growing." Wilson shook her hand, noting how firm and confident her grip was, just like everything else about her he had failed to see before. As Dr. Carter walked away, he remained standing, watching her go, knowing that while one moment of prejudice had nearly cost a life, the same moment had also saved another, by awakening a conscience that had been too long asleep. The week following his conversation with Dr. Carter brought many changes to Wilson's life. During his security shifts at Henderson Executive Airport, he found himself paying special attention to how he treated every passenger who walked through his checkpoint. Each interaction became a chance to prove to himself that he could do better. One quiet afternoon, Wilson sat at his desk with his lunch untouched beside him. Instead of eating, he was focused on his tablet, reading an article about Dr. Carter's medical achievements. The more he learned, the more his shame deepened. But this shame was different now. It was no longer just about his actions. It was about all the times in his life when he might have misjudged others based on nothing but his own prejudices. "Still doing research?" April asked, approaching his desk with a kind smile. Their relationship had begun to warm since his apology to Dr. Carter. She noticed the article on his screen. "She's amazing, isn't she?" Wilson nodded, scrolling through the long list of Dr. Carter's accomplishments. 20 years of groundbreaking surgeries, over 300 successful operations, multiple medical awards, and he shook his head, I treated her like she didn't belong here. April pulled up a chair beside his desk. "You know what's impressive, Mr. Wilson. Not everyone would take the time to learn from their mistakes like this. As they talked, Supervisor Roberts walked over, carrying some papers. James, I've got good news. The diversity training program you asked about, they've approved your request to help develop it. Wilson's eyes lit up. Really? They want my help with that? Roberts nodded. Your experience could help others learn. Sometimes the best teachers are those who face their own prejudices and chosen to change. Later that afternoon, Wilson found himself in a situation that would test his growth. A young woman in a hijab approached his checkpoint, carrying several heavy-looking bags. 6 months ago, he might have immediately called for additional screening. Instead, he smiled warmly. Good afternoon, ma'am. Let me help you with those bags through the scanner. The woman looked surprised at his offer of help, then grateful. As he checked her credentials, she was a visiting professor heading to a conference. Wilson made sure to be thorough but respectful. After she passed through, she turned back to him. Thank you, she said. You know, I travel frequently, and this is the first time I've felt so comfortable at a security checkpoint. Her words hit Wilson hard. How many travelers had felt uncomfortable or unwelcome because of security officers like him? How many talented professionals had he and others humiliated simply because they didn't match their preconceptions? That evening, as his shift ended, Wilson sat down to write in the journal he had started keeping since the incident. He wrote about the visiting professor, about his conversation with April, about the training program he would help develop. But mostly, he wrote about the changes he felt happening within himself. Each day, he wrote, I'm learning to see people differently, not as categories or assumptions, but as individuals with their own stories, their own achievements, their own struggles. Dr. Carter didn't just save the governor's daughter that day. In a way, she saved me too. As he packed up his things to head home, Wilson noticed a new memo on the bulletin board. The airport was organizing a staff meeting about inclusive practices, and they wanted him to share his story. The old Wilson would have refused, too embarrassed to admit his mistakes. But now, he saw it as another opportunity to help others learn from his experience. He took out his phone and opened the email Dr. Carter had given him, where she'd said he could reach out if he ever wanted to discuss his journey of change. Dr. Carter, he began typing, I wonder if you'd be willing to speak at our staff training session. Your perspective could help us all do better. The sun was setting outside the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But unlike the shadows of prejudice that had once darkened his judgment, these shadows were just temporary. Tomorrow would bring another day of learning, another chance to prove that people could change, another opportunity to make the airport a welcoming place for everyone who passed through its doors. 2 weeks after Wilson sent his email, Dr. Carter returned to Henderson Executive Airport. This time, she wasn't rushing to save a life. She had accepted Wilson's invitation to speak at the staff training session. The morning air was crisp, and the terminal buzzed with anticipation as security staff and airport employees gathered in the conference room. Wilson stood at the entrance, greeting his colleagues as they arrived. He wore his uniform with a different kind of pride now, not the rigid authority he once displayed, but a humble confidence that came from facing his own mistakes and working to be better. Nervous? April asked. Stopping beside him with 2 coffee cups, she handed him one. A little, Wilson admitted, taking a sip. It's not easy to stand up in front of everyone and talk about your biggest mistake. That's what makes it meaningful, a familiar voice said behind them. Dr. Carter had arrived, dressed in a professional blue suit, carrying a small briefcase. Wilson straightened up. Dr. Carter, thank you for coming. I can't tell you how much this means to all of us. She smiled warmly. When I got your email about the changes you're trying to make here, I knew I had to come back. Supervisor Roberts approached to welcome Dr. Carter, and soon the conference room was full. Wilson noticed how different the atmosphere was from just a few weeks ago. His colleagues, who had once watched in uncomfortable silence as he blocked Dr. Carter's path, now sat ready to learn from both of them. Dr. Carter began her presentation by telling her story, not just about that day at the airport, but about her journey through medical school, residency, and her career as a surgeon. She spoke about the countless times she had faced prejudice and how she had persevered. But today, she said, looking at Wilson, I want to talk about something different. I want to talk about the power of change. Wilson stood up next to her, his heart pounding but his voice steady. 3 weeks ago, I was the problem, he began. I let my prejudices nearly prevent a life-saving surgery. I thought I was just doing my job, but I was really just hiding behind rules to justify my bias. The room was silent as Wilson shared how the incident had affected him. He talked about his sleepless nights, his research into Dr. Carter's work, and his realization about how many others he might have wrongly judged throughout his career. The hardest part, he admitted, was facing the truth about myself. But Dr. Carter showed me something important that day. It's never too late to learn and change. Dr. Carter stepped forward again. Change isn't just about one moment of realization, she explained. It's about what you do after that moment. Mr. Wilson didn't just apologize and move on. He took action. She clicked to the next slide, showing the new training programs and procedures Wilson had helped develop for the airport. There were guidelines for respectful screening, workshops on unconscious bias, and a system for reporting and addressing discrimination. These changes will help ensure that no other professional, regardless of their race, gender, or background, faces what I faced that day, Dr. Carter said. And it all started because one person chose to learn from his mistake instead of denying it. As the presentation ended, Wilson's colleagues came up to share their own stories and experiences. Many admitted to times when they too had made assumptions about passengers based on appearance. The conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. You've started something important here, Dr. Carter told Wilson as they walked through the terminal afterward. This goes beyond just you and me now. Wilson nodded, watching as a diverse group of passengers moved through the security checkpoint, each being treated with the same respect and professionalism. I see things differently now, he said. Every person who walks through those doors has their own story, their own achievements. My job isn't to judge them, it's to ensure their safety while respecting their dignity. Dr. Carter smiled, reaching into her briefcase. That's why I brought this, she said, pulling out a framed photograph. It showed her with the governor's daughter, both smiling broadly after the successful surgery. I want you to hang this in the security office. Let it remind everyone that our prejudices can have real consequences, but so can our choice to change. Wilson took the photo carefully, feeling the weight of its meaning. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, and in its light, he could see how far he had come, and how far they all still had to go. 6 months had passed since the day Wilson blocked Dr. Carter from boarding her flight. Henderson Executive Airport had changed in ways that went far beyond new training programs and security procedures. The transformation could be seen in the small, everyday interactions between staff and passengers. On this particular morning, Wilson stood at his usual post, watching the sunrise through the terminal windows. The framed photo of Dr. Carter and the governor's daughter hung prominently in the security office, serving as a daily reminder of both a near tragedy and a powerful lesson. Mr. Wilson, called April from the counter. Did you see the news? Dr. Carter won the National Medical Excellence Award. Wilson smiled, walking over to look at April's tablet. There was Dr. Carter on the screen, accepting a prestigious award for her contributions to pediatric neurosurgery. The article mentioned how she had not only revolutionized surgical techniques, but also become an advocate for diversity in medicine and aviation security. She mentioned us in her acceptance speech, April said excitedly, turning up the volume on a video clip. Change happens in unexpected places, Dr. Carter was saying in the video. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to open our eyes, but what matters most is what we do after that moment. I want to thank the staff at Henderson Executive Airport, who turned one incident of prejudice into an opportunity for widespread positive change. Wilson felt a mixture of pride and humility hearing those words. His own story had become part of the airport's training manual, shared with new security officers as an example of how bias awareness could make a critical difference. Just then, Supervisor Roberts approached with a group of new trainees. And this is Mr. Wilson, he told them. He's now our head of diversity and security training, in addition to his regular duties. The trainees looked at Wilson with interest. They had just watched the video of his story in their orientation. One young officer raised her hand. Sir, what's the most important lesson you learned from that day? Wilson thought carefully before answering. That security isn't just about following rules. It's about protecting people while respecting their dignity. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with the same respect we'd want for ourselves or our families. As if on cue, The terminal doors opened, and a woman in a wheelchair entered, wearing a lab coat and carrying medical credentials. 6 months ago, someone might have questioned whether she was really a doctor. Today, Wilson watched with satisfaction as the security team smoothly and respectfully processed her credentials, offered appropriate assistance, and wished her a good flight. "That's Dr. Rodriguez," April mentioned. "She's a regular now. Says she chose our airport specifically because of how we treat all passengers with respect." The morning continued, and Wilson noticed more examples of how things had changed. A young man in traditional Muslim dress was greeted with a warm smile. A transgender passenger received the same professional courtesy as everyone else. An elderly black woman using a walker was assisted with patience and care. During his lunch break, Wilson checked his email and found a message from Dr. Carter. She was planning another visit to the airport, this time to film a documentary about institutional change and the power of confronting bias. She wanted Wilson to share his story again, this time with a national audience. "Your experience," she wrote, "shows people that change is possible at any age, in any profession. Sometimes the most powerful changes start in the most unexpected places." As Wilson looked around the terminal, he saw how true those words were. The airport had become a model for other facilities across the country. Security teams from other cities now came to learn from their example. The governor had even cited their program in a speech about institutional reform. But the real change could be seen in the small moments, in the confident stride of diverse professionals walking through security, in the respectful interactions between staff and passengers, in the way people who once might have felt unwelcome now moved through the terminal with ease. The framed photo in the security office had been joined by others. Pictures of successful professionals from all backgrounds who had passed through their terminal, each one adding to the story of transformation that had begun on that fateful morning. Wilson's phone buzzed with a text from his granddaughter. "Saw Dr. Carter on TV, Grandpa. So proud of how you helped change things." He smiled, tucking the phone away and returning to his post. The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating the terminal with warm light. In that light, Wilson could clearly see what he had once been blind to: the beautiful diversity of human achievement, waiting to be recognized and respected by those willing to open their eyes and their hearts.